Good morning. My name is Lee Horner, or alternatively Lee Lightfoot, depending on what I am writing. Though as my PhD graphic novel describes, there is a fairly complicated family history regarding migration, illegitimacy, and an early 20th century lifeline, which means that Lightfoot is my mother's maiden name, and my legal name, Horner, is in fact my great-grandmother's maiden name. I write and illustrate mostly as Lee Lightfoot in comics, concept art and scenes for TV and film licenses. I also run a search hub and publishing imprint Black Ship Books, which converges with the academic interests of my graphic novel based PhD. In working on my grandfather's story as a potential prose novel, I previously had pretensions towards what you could call high literature, but I mostly now write in genre fiction or non-fiction, with a particular interest in the psychological themes described in the novel. I've got a strange academic background in that I've alternated between the humanities and the scientific, which is reflected in my approach to the thematic concerns of the PhD. This means that when exploring the human condition, I tend to exist in both a poetic domain and a more rigorous, obsessively detailed account of experience that is reflected in the novel's title, The Shameful Eye. So, trigger warning, it's conventional nowadays to issue a warning if there are any potentially harmful themes in an academic presentation. I've really tried to create as vanilla a presentation as possible, but most of the content of the graphic novel is of a controversial nature. But if any of you feel the need to leave the room at any point, I'll understand and won't be offended. Equally, don't worry about fielding what you think might be a provocative question at the end, as most of these experiences have been exorcised in terms of my own opinion on them. I generally share the common belief that for a writer, both positive and negative experiences are all grist for the mill, even traumatic ones. In essence, I bring you into this world of life writing, in which you're interacting with other human beings, sometimes having difficult experiences like these, at the same time as knowingly observing them and recording their quirks and idiosyncrasies. It was certainly both an exciting and unnerving prospect as I began to collect names and labels for potentially pathological behaviours that were exhibited sometimes by friends and family members. Most of these psychological insights have been presented somewhere before. It's just that I've brought it together and repackaged them in what I think is a fresh perspective on the human condition. For me, it answers a decade-long narrative dramatic question on where the invisible power of a simple conversation seen between two people might come from. Originally, I was interested in the potential for two people discovering or chipping away at each other's secrets, but over the years my obsession has come to be about how an individual is caused to discover his or her own secrets. Often we romanticize science generally as charting the invisible, but in fact it has been responsible at various times through the 19th and 20th century for denying the reality of particular relationships purely because they were invisible. No scientist can question, now, the fact that there is no such thing as a brain changing and evolving on its own. It's always at minimum a binary process in which one brain changes in response to another human being. For the specific themes of the human condition within the novel, there are three writers and speakers I will highlight: Hazel Marcus, Jonathan Shea and Carol Gilligan. So, with that warning out of the way, I've catered this presentation to both the writing of a graphic novel and then broader ideas described in the novel on the human condition and the lifeline. These broader ideas should prove useful to any writer not interested in graphic novels, but in writing the human condition purely in prose. Beyond writing the human being generally, you should find this useful if you're interested in writing about families, toxic romantic relationships, intergenerational trauma, extreme ends of the human experience such as psychosis, or just the writing of internal character arcs generally. The two birds of the presentation's title refer to the elaborate lifeline constructed by the character Hjalmar in Henry Ibsen's play The Wild Duck, and the method by which I show the unravelling of such a lifeline, the narrative signal for this being what I call the Swan song. This narrative signal operates along the lines of moral injury, as described by Shea and Gilligan. The key takeaways for the presentation are that 1. A graphic novel can be more than just a short story, bolstered by illustrations, but that some of that criticism is warranted. And 2. Every character, both fictive and real, experiences some form of life lie, and this can be made infinitely fascinating to both reader and writer. My PhD thesis is titled The Shameful Eye, Using the Visual Aspect of Comics to Examine the Psychosocial Impact of Illness. Okay, so what do I mean by the shameful eye? The idea of the shameful eye is carried in my central visual motif of a black ellipse, which begins in the novel as the dilated pupil of death. To establish, there are poetic meanings for the novel's title, and one technical meaning that comes from the biology of trauma. The poetic meaning of the shameful eye combines both the pronoun I and the noun I together, broadly indicating that the self is routinely caused to withdraw, shame-like, by things it sees. The central technical meaning for this term would be a trauma-based withdrawal action by a human being. Particularly when witnessing something threatening, there is a psychological and physical withdrawal of the person under threat. Essentially, when the human being is caused to withdraw after witnessing threat, imagining something primal like a snail withdrawing into its shell, he or she desperately seeks out safety purely in a psychological realm with visual simulation. This is part of a previously very little understood freeze response, an alternative response to threat that does not involve fight or flight. This opposition is the means by which I will marshal both the poetic and the scientific in explaining the central problem of human ignorance and narcissism. The remit of the PhD, then, is not within creative writing, but within the academic domain of graphic medicine, which is the use of comics in medicine. This itself is part of medical humanities, which is now a compulsory part of medical training in many Western hospitals. The idea of this is to reduce the loss of empathy that we now know occurs when the human being becomes an object of study, when the person essentially becomes a thing or it. So with that technical explanation out of the way, let's move on to broader ideas on the graphic novel explored in the PhD. Two quite common criticisms of graphic novels as a unique form of reading experience are implied in the two words in the term graphic novel. Number 1, that many graphic novels do not in fact possess the substance of novels at all, but instead resemble short stories padded with imagery. 2, as an extension of point number 1, that the imagery does not add anything, and that many graphic novelists do not use the potential of graphic imagery to exploit the potential of the medium. I'm not here today to defend the medium, but I sought to address both critiques in my novel by using the visual aspect in a way that I feel cannot be easily executed in prose. My key innovations will be the black ellipse motif, the forehead timestamps, the use of a musical theme visually, and the meaning of the black and white aesthetic itself. Another common issue both academics and layman readers have had with graphic novels has been the very cliched content of graphic novel memoir in the 20th century, consisting with regularity of the fairly tedious lives of introverted white male creators. The peak of this criticism on a form of solipsistic male echo chamber would be a comment I heard recently on a writer like Joe Matt, who has chronicled his own life for years, but whose story at times would literally devolve into his own masturbation in a cupboard. This narrowly subjective demographic has definitely changed in the late 20th century, with one high watermark for critical response being the Pulitzer Prize awarded to Art Spiegelman's Mouse in 1992. This was as much a change towards a claim for such weighty, Holocaust-related subject matter as it was for anything relating to an inherent change in formalism within the medium. But later we have one central auteur of the medium, in more formalist terms, in the figure of Chris Ware, who in works like Building Stories has been compared to James Joyce. I would compare his innovations to the prose innovations I will remark on shortly, such as Mark Danielewski's visual use of prose in House of Leaves. But while Spiegelman, Ware and myself are all again white males, I believe my own story is far from tedious. The one thing I have never doubted is that I have rich autobiographical content to mine. But at some point the project moved away from describing a series of interesting life events to that of describing the human condition and a series of life lies. There was an opportunity, I felt, to use the autobiographical details to demonstrate what I believe is the power of a twist narrative. I still believe last act twists are substantive revelations to the reader, can fundamentally change the reading experience in deepening their engagement with the text. On the surface, the reader is in a way tricked throughout my novel with the emotive manipulation of looking at a central traumatic experience. The entirety of our family life was geared towards moulding my sister into a gymnastic champion, at which point she suddenly and unexpectedly dropped dead. This was interesting enough as a story to make the national tabloids at the time. The task as I saw it was to keep this overt drama at the forefront of the reader's mind in a way that mirrored my own experience. It was a story that overtook my daily life and became a life lie. As I built towards a subversion of that bereavement as an obvious and universal form of trauma, I see various setups throughout the narrative, importantly in the visuals. The intent is to have the reader follow my own development in carrying this as a false, or at least partial, trauma story, to be replaced by the end of the last act by something more psychologically universal, on the nature of the human condition and the life lie. The culmination of all these narratives would come to lead towards Jonathan Shea's idea of moral injury and what he calls the undoing of character. Okay, so from a technical angle, I chose black and white not only because this would be less time consuming for a novel of any substantial page count, but additionally I knew I wanted to use the black and white aesthetic at some level as a multi-level metaphor, using both traditional hand-drawn imagery and digital manipulation. There is also a legacy of novels such as Mouse that have weighty autobiographical material seemingly conveyed more seriously in stark black and white. The process, for anyone interested in the practical basics, involves page and chapter plans executed in a similar way to a prose work, but I then plan what to render in pencil on a large A3 size sheet of what is called Bristol board. When pencils are rendered to a satisfactory level, I then ink with pens and acrylic black paint over the top, finally rubbing out the pencil. From a story angle, especially for any story with particular psychological depth, I'm intensely interested in the way plot and structure can express a character's internal and external arc. In previously looking at the PhD thesis on narrative twists, I came across work in Russian formalist literary criticism on two central concepts. You must all, by necessity, work with these routinely, and in fact we live with these concepts every day, via our human memories and perception. One is termed fabula, which is the raw material of the story, or the full objective chronology of your own or your character's life. The second is sujet, which I will describe simply as the edit, the way we pick and choose, as writer, which elements to use and when. What interests me is how the edit, the sujet, can often be seen as the conscious life, with elements of the fabula driven into unconsciousness or the subconscious. Many twist movies and in fact novels, such as Before I Go to Sleep, exploit this idea of the conscious edit. The processes of previously redacted life events that slowly come to the surface are shared in psychotherapy and the types of stories I will talk about. In these tales, with a significant last act twist, within the edit of consciousness, previously hidden elements of the fabula can be slowly revealed, finally leading to a grand revelation that often shifts both the reader and the character's own perception of what has occurred. In the larger manuscript of what I eventually titled Twist Last Act Revelations of the Human Story, I explored very cheap twists relating to identity, largely in TV and film. What I call the cheap method is when, to begin the story a few minutes or even just seconds earlier, both viewer and protagonist would have witnessed the truth of that identity. I compared these types of twists to stories such as Memento, in which the edit itself carries the idea of some sort of necessary life lie as a psychological shield. This is why amnesia is such an easy way to create a twist narrative, but I believe amnesia is just an extreme way of describing the more universal life lie of the human condition, that of limitation. More broadly, if you look at what many writing gurus talk about as Joseph Campbell's monomyth, there tends to be a more substantial, extended, missing first act which is slowly revealed, such as in Harry Potter or Star Wars, for instance. This supports the idea that I've heard often. What you are writing routinely is in fact the ending to a much longer story, and that you should choose to begin your, in quotes, edit as close to the ultimate end as possible. Although I do cover several years in my graphic novel, partly to have a powerful character arc. The speculative scene in the psychiatrist's office could be taken to be the end of a process. We meet a character, me, who is finally about to come to terms with some fundamental life lies by excavating the edits that have occurred. The edited, revealing Campbellian monomyth tends to illustrate just how important the protagonist is to the fictive world. It is not, I believe, a coincidence then, as I explore in the novel, that the human storyteller, experiencing trauma or life threat, rewrites their own experience in this way, generating an almost Trumpian exaggeration of their own agency. This is because the safest thing to be in your imagination is infinitely powerful. And when you are under threat, you are desperate for safety. In the story, with a significant identity twist, both versions of the edit, that of things open to a character in fabula but not perceived, or things not open to the character because they have happened before they were even born, change the character's perception of their own identity by the time the last act is played out. The key difference would be that agency is routinely undermined in a twist narrative, as it will be in mine, whereas in monomyth, as one was fantastically satirized in the Lego movie, agency is bolstered to such an extent that the protagonist often appears godlike or messianic. I play with both concepts in my novel in terms of the construction of the life lie as a subjective edit. When I left behind my previous PhD thesis, what was interesting was that in migrating to the writing of what appeared to be an illness memoir that involved psychiatric case studies, I began to see themes of both undermined agency and messianic agency as constants in psychotherapy as part of the life lie that was seen as a pathological story. These themes appeared to involve elaborate life lies created in response to traumatic experience. In presenting this content to a reader, I want to use what academics have suggested is unique to the medium. It's a cliche to say that a picture paints 1,000 words, but in looking at the critique of graphic novels as using redundant visuals, it's important to consider the counter-thesis to this, that there are things a graphic novelist can do with a constructed gaze that are difficult to do in prose. I wanted to move beyond the usual confines of panels and bubbles by using both pure, unconfined imagery and pure text in a documentary format, particularly as I will be looking at hypergraphia, the psychiatric symptom of obsessive writing. An overlaid version of hypergraphia can be seen here in the third page. This writing, of which I personally have several million words across songs, poetry, short stories and non-fiction, was one of the logistical challenges and something that I might have to largely put aside for the PhD, due to time constraints. One question would be why hypergraphists write. I share the same experience of Alice Flaherty, author of The Midnight Disease, whose hypergraphia began after a bereavement. My interest was that, as indicated in my looping graphics, I slowly began to realise that I was writing about the same complex themes over and over. Related to this idea of a documentary format would be the main literary concept for the PhD. This originally came from an academic I was in communication with on what I was trying to do, David Herman. The term meta-pathography, originally coined by Peter Graham, means meta-illness narrative. I would use this to distinguish the novel from the growing number of pathographies published in the graphic novel medium from the late 20th century onward. The meta would come about as the artful transformation of the illness narrative genre, relying on the professional strengths of the author to remove themselves out of the potential suffering of any particular condition. At the times when I move beyond the individual and include extended family or other case studies, this becomes comparative meta-pathography. In comparing individuals, the meta becomes that of writing a meta-narrative that unites those sufferers, and Mark Shell did for polio and polio and its aftermath. The complex task ahead came to be how to represent what I was calling the shared experience of constructed life lies, especially if I wanted a powerful twist in the last act. When the illness refers to trauma or psychological suffering, then this idea of the meta-pathography becomes something not even considered by Graham himself. In particular, the history of psychiatry, from the outlandish and often disputed ideas of Freud to the life experience denying accounts of genetic determinism, have denied patients a genuine voice and routinely engaged in its own narrative brainwashing or gaslighting. A comparative metapathography would subvert the isolation found in victims of this sort of institutional gaslighting and reveal to them the universality of their experience. I don't necessarily agree with this definition of gaslighting. I don't agree that the aim is to drive someone mad. This is what I would define as the purpose of this sort of brainwashing, to control the story. The purpose of this control over the story, whether in families or society, is to orient people towards a particular goal. I believe Hazel Marcus, as I will describe shortly, brings to light the central stories sold to us as children. Peter Graham looks at Norman Cousins, Reynolds Price and Raymond Carver, but for the PhD I look at specific works by graphic novelists who I believe approach metapathography. Marbles by Ellen Forney looks directly at psychiatry, and while it does not, in my opinion, demonstrate a fully knowing meta-awareness of the author's own suffering, she does use the graphic of graphic novel in what I would call desirably progressive ways. Something akin to what Mark Danielewski does in prose with House of Leaves. Her page constructions defy easy description in forms usual to academic analysis of comics. Very little of the book, for instance, is rendered as traditional comic panels, those rectangular frames that are usually constitutive of a comic or graphic novel. Whereas Danielewski himself could be said to defy the usual prose frame of a novel's page, Forney presents medical information and comparative case studies of, in quotes, celebrity sufferers of manic depression in what appears an unconstrained series of image and text combinations. The unusual layout and visual style would appeal to one description that has been made of Danielewski's House of Leaves novel, that of being ergodic literature. Personally, I would definitely like to use this idea of the ergodic, described by Espen R. Seth as non-trivial effort required to allow the reader to traverse the text. While I allow for the fact that my project as narrative, but not as PhD, might be doomed to failure with this ambition, I do want it to be a text that has the potential for more than one reading. To facilitate the difficult task of decoding this non-trivial effort, and also to approach this question of the tedious life experience of the typical white male creator, I opted for a very clear, distinct structure that I would complicate within chapters. E.g., the emotive or psychological tone of each of the 4 parts would be clearly situated in a way that was not clarified in the living of those events. This idea of artifice laid onto biographical details is definitely a fecund area of research, but it's not limited to the area of creative writing and literature. Academics in multiple domains such as psychology, neuroscience, political science and even economics now know that our personal experience is at heart some sort of simplified artifice extracted from the nuance of life experience. Every story, or story meme, is a huge oversimplification and edit. The relative success of the story meme is in fact down to the edited simplification. The greater the ease of communication, the greater the power of that story. This simplification has been suggested as the power of a story told in narcissistic ignorance, a monochromatic simplicity of self and other I carry throughout the novel, literally in black and white. The cover story for the novel, and therefore the reader, is that this is a bereavement memoir, but it is really about the power of stories to control our lives. Beyond this, the power of narcissism as a simplified and exaggerated story. It's only in the last chapter that myself, as protagonist, must confront the central problem of human narcissism. I've plotted 16 chapters, divided into 4 themed parts. Broadly, there's a geometric acceleration of narrative time from 2 years of biographical time covered in Part 1, The Despair Tree, 4 years in Part 2, Unbearable Lightness, 8 years in Part 3, Fallen Id Dolls, and 16 years in Part 4, Strange Attractors. After several years thinking about the work itself, there were 3 major changes in thematic focus that were reflected in the title. The title changed from Cuckoo to Cuckoo's Clock, with a key set of brackets around the possessive S, to the shameful I. I've retained the central black ellipse motif throughout, but the interaction between chapters and novel title have now altered dramatically. Originally, the title Cuckoo was to reflect the multiple possible meanings of cuckoo, from a derogatory term for madness to the observed phenomenon of the actual bird itself, to a more poetic idea of both nested narratives and parasitic narratives. Moving to Cuckoo's Clock I included some of the original metaphor, but added the key bracketed possessive apostrophe to indicate a potential difference in agency between cuckoo clock as a noun and something like a mechanical cuckoo, itself inside another system but controlling it, or parasitizing on that system, reflecting the idea of the story itself as something powerful and parasitic. With the change to the shameful I, nesting the pronoun I inside the E of the I, the metaphor became more primal. Apart from anything else, it allowed me to work inside the boundaries of last act twists as outlined by the formalist literary critic Zvetan Todorov. It seems fairly original, even in Todorov's terms, that in the last act this story reveals that it is itself part of a PhD thesis called The Shameful I. So far, each chapter also has what I would describe as a rhythmic, almost musical pattern. The structure reflects the fact that, looking at novels like Ellen Forney's Marbles, a graphic novel can vary between pure text or pure imagery and does not have to contain panels. Each chapter begins with a white font on black title page, then a wordless page of black and white art to convey something about the theme of the chapter. I retain the doubled, bracketed nature of each title, which harkens back to Cuckoo's Clock as the novel's title, but the open or closed brackets now represent the eye and limited perception. The single page of art is followed by a more conventional panelled scene. Again, there is the same question here we might have with prose for something like Danielewski's House of Leaves. The non-trivial work we are asking the reader to do is not the same as attempting to confuse the reader. I'm not trying to write the graphic equivalent of Finnegan's Wake, and as such a recognisable format for some portion of the novel is necessary in some ways to ground the reader. So a chapter title and chapter graphic is followed by a key scene from autobiographical memory. This itself was one of the difficult tasks to think about. How would any of us think about structuring our psychological life in just 16 key scenes? The reader's experience of each of these scenes will be inflected by the next element, very much like a musical note, but in this case a single ellipse bubble containing the instruction "come back to me." But as this was a PhD project, the massive amount of information involved needed some sort of rhythm akin to a musical pattern. Having a narrative as a demand of an academic project would be part of another presentation entirely. For now, this particular form of artifice, the repeated "come back to me" bubble, should be assumed by the reader to be spoken by the psychiatrist, as each time we return to what appears as some form of therapy session, as if the protagonist, and by default the reader, as proxy, comes back to the same psychiatrist, possibly via what we would call traumatic dissociation. There are other meanings to the bubble I will return to shortly. I had some creative writing issues straight out of the blocks, and these related to what I'd already theorised and researched on reader experience and immersion in narrative. The central narrative conceit that the story is a tale told to a psychiatrist in a clinical setting involves a necessary pulling out of the action via flashbacks and risks demolishing the sense of narrative time I usually prefer. Additionally, the fact that this was to be a meta-pathography or meta-illness narrative involving substantial scientific depth on the human condition risked formalising the text itself as a very dry read. The method by which I hope I have managed to avoid this clinical coldness is by introducing very poetic, dramatic imagery that moves beyond the usual genre confines of memoir and ends in territory verging on sci-fi and psychological horror. My deliberate ambition with the last act was to in fact amp up both the deep observations on the human condition and a more traditional protagonist-antagonist conflict with my characters of 2020 and No Face. No Face and 2020 would come to represent what Arthur Frank in The Wounded Storyteller would call a chaos narrative versus a restitution narrative. I would suggest that the great problem with psychiatry in the 20th century was that patients were maintained within a chaos narrative which did not explain their problem. No Face would represent the chaotic horror of that ignorance, with 2020 as the symbolic future self, with a restoration of health necessary in many meta-pathographies. Here I was focusing on the human condition and ways in which people construct what Henry Gibson would call the life lie. In so doing, I would use part 1, the despair tree, to look at 2 autobiographical years, which had 3 central experiences with death. One central experience here of my being the key witness in an attempted murder trial, bookended by a serious car crash and walking in one morning to find what I thought was my sister staring at the ceiling. Each of these events, of what I would call peak experience, took me close to the proximity of death, which is part of my black ellipse motif. The prospect of death and bereavement is replaced by the question of why parents often become obsessed with their child's sporting achievement. This again relates to narcissism and the by now well documented phenomenon of the golden child. The surface tale of our entire family, geared towards making my sister a gymnastic champion, becomes the question of the agency of children in these situations. While the two stories, one of death and one of narcissism, seem quite different, we see by the end of the last chapter that narcissism is there precisely to form a psychological defense against death itself. The use of a forehead brain state tattoo from 2020 to no face, and that's no face considered as both absent information or infinite text overlay, can refer to the constructed gaze and the self looking at the self, looking at the complexity of memory. Only the self in the original scene of the psychiatric's office has no forehead tattoo, and I refer to him as patient zero. This graphic innovation of tattoos, I believe, allows some depth that would be very difficult to pull off in prose without thousands of words in order to ensure the reader is not confused. The implication explored in the novel is that in a normal, neurotypical situation, it would be impossible to really excavate brain states of a character like this without huge amounts of subjective distortion. As it is, it was only when I began to collect scenes for the novel within the NHS that I saw indicators of what is termed hypermemory. Now, with or without traumatic life experiences, hypermemory is found in those that possess it, troubling properties of memories that force themselves on sufferers and do not degrade in the usual way. The standard degradation and rewriting of a memory would be one way in which we construct the life lie. This entire problem of edited and distorted subjectivity gave me pause for thought on representing real people. Even if I displayed aspects of hypermemory, how much truth could I claim to have archived in memory? This is discussed in the novel Between Selves. As part of a chaos narrative, Part 1 has something to say on the subject of cognitive load and mental health. The use of multiple brain states all looking at each other or a single memory communicates some of this cognitive load. Another simpler thesis on cognitive load is what clinical psychologist John Reed states as bad things happen and they mess you up. One page I plan on using so far is this large white 193 on black. This is the result of several sets of meta-analysis by multiple researchers who indicate this as the number of times higher your risk is of adult psychosis if you had 5 or more adverse factors in childhood compared to a child who had none. This is a very strong result. As Reed likes to say in public lectures, there is absolutely nothing even remotely similar in all of the decades spent on researching individual genes. As a comparison, if you take a male lung cancer patient, he would be 23 times more likely to have developed that cancer than a patient who had never smoked. It's as close as you can get to saying that psychosis is a result of trauma. This first part of the novel, then, would act as a platform for both the protagonist and reader to process these adverse events in adolescence. Part 2, Unbearable Lightness, would look at the consequences of these events and a constructed life lie worthy of Ibsen's The Wild Duck, a literary reference I will return to shortly. Part 3, Fallen Id Dolls, looks at the crumbling of the lie and in particular aspects of repressed sexuality. Everything is tied up in strange attractors, in which literally the ghosts of earlier life events are exorcised by my own future self from the year 2020. This brings me to the central Come Back to Me bubble on black, which I have to say is probably my favourite invention. So far, what this means is 16 chapter setups and a final revealing Come Back to Me from my wife for one, hopefully powerful payoff, when we discover it's not the psychiatrist at all that is uttering this instruction. This central Come Back to Me bubble is a genuine repeat instruction from my wife and comes to symbolise the problem of trauma, dissociation and therefore conscious removal from family life. The final page, which is itself a little meta, shows it does a look over the shoulder back at the reader and in fact in a way contradicting the final statement I'm here. Technically, to look away from the path and at the reader is to imply that I am not fully there in this traditional family activity of taking a walk in the countryside, not present. It also mirrors the key reference in the novel to Greek mythology and the goddess Metanoia, who looks over her shoulder in a process of regret over things done or not done. With this last look at the viewer, I leave the story less than tidy. Engaging in this process of metanoia, I establish in the novel as the opposite of mindful non-duality in Buddhism. Every come back to me signals this separation from the present, adding another layer to the narrating of memory. The final look suggests I am always partly with the outside observer and the shameful I, whether that outside observer is a reader or myself in removed memory. The power of the reveal of the meaning behind the come back to me bubble comes from my interest in twists and Russian formalist literary criticism. I would call this an ontogenic last act, or an act revealing the being and origin of the story. One of these critics, influenced by Russian formalism, would be Svetan Todorov. Todorov cites literary works such as Liaisons des Jureurs, in which the end of the work reveals something important to the construction of the work itself. The final letter in that 18th century epistolary novel explains how the entire collection of letters, e.g. the novel itself, was published. Although I do include letters in The Shameful I, the importance for me here is the way the final reveal can alter the reading experience. In part 4 of the novel, Strange Attractors, the reader will follow where I pick up from the intellectually elaborate life lie begun at Lancaster University. Like the final letter in Dangerous Liaisons, the final PhD thesis, The Shameful I, will reveal how information from all my PhD proposals is collected and begins to focus on a common theme. A little like Danielewski's House of Leaves, although many of his outside references were fake, my reader will have the ability to read outside the text and track the protagonist's, intellectual development via other texts. This tracking will be inflected by one of the final reveals on trauma, that I in fact possess elements of said hypermemory. This has implications for trauma in that any type of memory, traumatic or otherwise, will not degrade in the usual fashion. So, for instance, the reader should finally have a biological neurobiological reason for why an essay like Thomas Machiavelli's Art History or Sacred History would circulate in memory for over 20 years. Similarly, it explains how I was able to track dozens of family members and the pathological narratives that were told about each, often switching scapegoating strategies from one child to another, while those individuals perpetuating their narratives either failed to remember them or refused to. In the reader discovering that I had the task of writing an illness memoir that happened to be part of a PhD, they will see I had to consider both research and reader experience as potentially conflicting interests. They will not only witness in the last act the problem of writing a narrative for a PhD, but the problem of using life writing as a form of psychotherapy. This life writing as therapy would then satisfy what we looked at earlier as Peter Graham's idea of metapathography, as removing the author from suffering, or at least creating a narrative distance from it. The fact, which I will cover briefly in the last chapter, that the Research Ethics Committee's final academic hurdle on this point took months to wrangle, adds complexity to the last chapter, as does the fact that the warnings from academic friends on life writing, as intrusive to the very life you are writing, came to fruition. Part of the complexity of the novel's ending will be the problem of a PhD, partially conceived as therapy, forcing into existence life experiences that were particularly harmful. But this again foregrounds this idea of a battle between the horror of No-Face and the almost zen-like serenity of 2020, suggesting suffering results from a lack of explanation. One solution on the tension between researcher and storyteller was to use this split in an original way. I would build to a huge collision of non-fiction research and the psychological horror genre within the narrative of the last chapter, using the characters of No-Face and 2020, who would rewrite her experience in a very different fashion. The black absence of chaotic ignorance projects back in time, as No-Face essentially wreaks havoc in memory, finally revealing a healthy set of frighteningly sharp teeth in what up to that point has been a face as void identity. When No-Face literally consumes a number of characters in backstory, in the last chapter, 2020 runs a counter-campaign of using each new, in quotes, research truth on the human condition to recontextualize some life event or life lie. Back to Arthur Frank's The Wounded Storyteller, and I wanted to look at the life lie in terms of what he indicated as the trope of old folk tales, naming the antagonist. For physical illness, this process can last years, with a medical diagnosis being the relief the patient needs before treatment. The illness is the antagonist to be confronted. Within psychiatry, this idea of labels as accurate diagnostic categories has been entirely disputed in the last few years. In one potential page in the novel, I look at what I call the big head little head thesis, using Sylvia Plath and Albert Einstein as textbook examples of what I refer to as residual misogyny masquerading as scientific paradigm. And this is not some silly theory from yesteryear. This is a current model in the hard biological sciences. Literally, it states that a father's genes compete to produce a big head and brain, which creates traits of an autistic spectrum, whereas the mother's genes compete to create a small head and traits that look like a schizophrenic, borderline, or manic depressive spectrum. I critique this in the novel and point out that all these types of confusing, conflicting stories just add to the chaos of confusing stories within toxic families. As an extension of Frank's idea of naming the antagonist and the possibility of naming a bad story itself as an antagonist, I found recurring themes that appear to link illness narratives, psychotherapy, and various fictional works that had nothing to do with illness. I took Frank's naming idea and saw that characters in fiction, autobiographical non-fiction, and patients in psychotherapy had to exorcise some form of bad story. Both in formulating my last act, and then once I decided on an almost supernatural exorcism in the finale, I gave the process requiring exorcism a name. I took this neologism of ghosting, meaning lack of communication, and combined it with the popular idea of a character having a ghost as a haunting of the present by something from backstory. So, from this binary of a problem and its possible solution via exorcism, I looked at this idea in The Wounded Storyteller. Frank indicated the literary trope was particularly interesting for illness narratives. This idea changed when applied to different genres. It can be an obvious necessity in crime fiction and might involve naming multiple red herring killers. In supernatural horror, it can involve one long extended naming that comes to be a metaphor for an internal antagonist in something like the recent acclaimed Australian horror movie The Babadook. Within an illness narrative, it can be the illness itself or aspects of the process of overcoming it. For physical illness, there is generally always the first step of medical diagnosis before treatment, but as I researched the novel's themes, I found this to be hugely problematic in the history of psychiatry. Processes seen in talking therapies, when they are genuinely helpful and not themselves pathological, look very much like processes seen when writing character arcs, when something akin to a psychological exorcism or just a slow realization is involved. Ibsen's contention would seem to be that there is a danger in removing the life lie, as it is there in particular as a psychological defense. In my narrative, 2020 acts to offer, in quotes, a full exorcism in that he seeks to bring his previous selves into line with his own belief that the very human self is an illusion. For 2020 and Buddhism, the construction of the life lie is the construction of the self, central to the human condition. But there are ways of bringing this construction into consciousness without bringing about the downfall of the psyche. Here you can see Ibsen's Wild Duck and the first appearance of the Swan song in The Shameful Eye. The musical notes first come from the mouth of a medical professional as a substitute for his own spoken words back in 1993. The song then becomes literally, as a relevant in memory, the last words sung before death. Strangely, it was only when I revisited the actual song and the precise lyrics that a potentially cheesy 90s electro pop song, Sweet Harmony, gives greater psychological meaning to the novel's ending and multiple selves, with different forward timestamps, different stories, different life lies in need of integration. So of course the lyrics were too good not to be used, which will require permissions to be granted. As soon as I realised how apt they were, I developed the plan to have the repressed memories, ring-fenced by the life lie, shown only as I sing those lyrics again in the final scene. As noted, the Swan song is a challenge to a constructed lifeline worthy of the central character Hjalmar in Ibsen's play. As with the suffering caused by the character Gregers in The Wild Duck, the pain that is often caused by truth-telling illuminates why the lie is there in the first place. It would also indicate why there might not be such a thing as painless psychotherapy. It's almost like ripping off a plaster, the plaster being a false persona present to shield us from pain. Ibsen shows, uncomfortably, the possible tragic repercussions of removing the shield of the lifeline. The wild duck of the play's title, and Hjalmar's daughter as a proxy for the duck, come to be a sacrifice that needs to be made to face the life lie. This is one literary version of the life lie, with other examples being Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh and Arthur Miller's All My Sons. The USA and its literary production has a uniquely interesting relationship to narcissism, as I finally describe it in The Shameful Eye, when I narrate the rise of Trump. Many American writers have written about the life lie, while at the same time conscious that this critique of narcissism was not ideal for US audiences. With the possibility of literal references to these plays within the novel in a 90s English literature class, either the notes of the Swan song or this partial inversion here, the silhouetted gymnast icon of performance and narcissism, could potentially appear in the margins of the novel. These, hovering fly-like, could indicate something on the periphery of consciousness. The gymnast icon would carry this idea of childhood performance manifested as a life lie. As a support for the idea that many of us perform a type of second-hand agency throughout our lives, I came across this book by Bronnie Ware. I tend to believe that the backward-looking perceptions Ware collected from the patients in palliative care have particular value. Many patients had this sense only when confronted by the prospect of certain death, that they had lived a false persona, not true to their selves, which I will look at briefly in a moment when I return to Carol Gilligan's account of moral injury in literature. Beyond the use of black and white as metaphorical, the reason that telling the life lie in the visual medium of the graphic novel might be appealing is that there is an interesting relationship between language, looking and acting in the social brain. Only in the last few years have we really begun to understand how important it is to be seen by other human beings, and more specifically, to be seen to be acting in a particular way, linking back to Ware's top deathbed regret. This visual need is central to both shame and the desirable lack of shame seen in what is called healthy human narcissism. In some ways, then, it is inauthentic to talk about there being anything particularly unique about Ibsen's character Hjalmar identifying with a false narrative. We are all, in some way, our own unreliable narrators, performing what we believe is expected of us. How this performance is essentially a false self is supposed to be difficult to perceive. Because I am particularly interested in human narcissism, I am broadly more interested in the USA than the UK, as being an archetypical example of my two central domains of narcissism, being seen to be good and being seen to be good at. My plan for now is to bring the final chapter in line with the events of wider society at the time of the US election and the rise of Donald Trump as an overt narcissist and possible mirror of No-Face. Kurt Anderson's recent book Fantasyland confirms that there are two types of fantasy behind the birth of the USA, the religious and the capitalist. These two are also fundamental to the two central domains of narcissism I explore in the novel, of being good and being good at. Come to the surface in part 4 of the novel, Strange Attractors, is that I use them to examine families, codependence and narcissism. The research by Hazel Marcus on scripts, or what we might call stories, of independence versus interdependence, also altered my trajectory in exploring the human condition in the novel. She has shown clearly different consequences from exposing people to these very different ideas of how we should act. An archetypically Western, white, educated, wealthy, male, Trumpian worldview on independence corresponds well with values of performance related to the individual and being good at. The demographic inversion corresponds well to being taught to be good morally, which always involves some sort of enforced interdependence. When these two differing stories become pathologically extreme, we have, on the one hand, Trumpian, almost messianic belief in one's own individual agency, and on the other, almost complete mental paralysis in being unable to act in your own interests. You see these two extreme versions of agency over and over again in psychiatric case studies. While Jonathan Shea's moral injury, described in Achilles in Vietnam, is largely gendered towards the history of warrior culture and trauma, Carol Gilligan's version of moral injury is gendered in the other direction, and the values female characters feel internal resistance to. Those studying war after Shea have cited individual actions as the central source of intense moral regret, but Shea extends to injury via the actions of an authority figure, very much like Gilligan. In her version, moral injury comes about as a series of violated values in child or adolescent development. She gives multiple examples of characters experiencing the lifeline from a feminist perspective. This form of gendered moral injury, which does not have to be exclusively female, will be explored in Part 3 of The Shameful Eye, Fallen Id Dolls, and revisited in Part 4, Strange Attractors. The idea behind Gilligan's version of moral injury is that women and young girls are sold a particular gendered life lie. Gilligan claims that character inauthenticity is a central site of trauma and gives as examples Iphigenia in Euripides' Iphigenia in Tauris, the eponymous heroine of Jane Eyre, Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, Frankie in The Member of the Wedding, Rahel in The God of Small Things, Claudia in The Bluest Eye, and Tambu in Nervous Conditions. Marcus has demonstrated that the conditions for each extreme can be transmitted quite rapidly in experimental conditions to, for instance, impact the cognition of a participant. This would just confirm what those of us who have existed within pathological families have suspected. Knowledge largely denied by a patriarchal society, as Gilligan might say, denying the role of both emotion and interdependence in human cognition. In experimental situations, Marcus simply encourages a script in which either the participant has power over another person or another person has power over them. She is highlighting the bias of these stories of dependence in everything from education to criminology. Here in the West, it has been shown that income inequality itself is a generator of the type of Trumpian narcissism I've described. Looking at case studies that I would use for satisfying the status of comparative metapathography, every case study I've looked at contains these extremes of interdependence and independence. Taken to a pathological extreme, independence indoctrinated into a child results in everything Marcus has recorded, such as lack of empathy and narcissistic judgment as seen in Trump, etc., plus a belief, no matter how bizarre, that they can do anything. This is inverted in the extreme interdependence of codependent families, in which the pathology raises paranoia about the judgments and implicit watching by other people, to such an extent that no matter how bizarre, those other people, the watchers, can do anything to us. This would include any type of invasion, either bodily or psychological. Of course, there is an inherent paradox in anything like the Trumpian, or my own experience of achievement by proxy in sport. It's the extreme codependence of a parent, the emotional need of the parent, that leads them to enforce an idea of independent glory. Taken in these terms, Trump is just as much an unperson as Catherine Penny of Dante's Cure. The elements from Catherine Penny's life come up repeatedly in the psychiatric case studies I look at in the novel. Bereavement, so father was killed in Korea, the child internalising a parent's illness, such as depression, the feeling that the parent's situation is the child's fault, this domain of pathologically needing to be extra good, the idea of conditional love tied up in the belief Catherine had to keep her love, and the psychology of a parent who does not understand separate identity. For the status of unperson, we can look at one of the celebrity case studies in Ellen Forney's Marbles, that of Vincent van Gogh. Forney mostly ignores any possibility that his issues were anything but a mixture of innate genius and madness. In fact, he was a Vincent van Gogh sandwiched between two other Vincent van Goghs. The first Vincent, Willem van Gogh, was born and died exactly a year before the artist on March 30th, 1852. Even the church register gave the famous Van Gogh the same number, 29, as his deceased brother. It was not uncommon back then for families to name a child after a previously deceased child. Vincent would have visited a grave with his name and birthday on it. The closest person to our Vincent, who clearly had attachment issues, was his brother Theo. Theo had a child in 1890 he again named Vincent Willem van Gogh. Only 6 months later, Van Gogh killed himself. His independence of identity was voided on both sides. Although clearly you could say Theo was just honouring his brother, it has been speculated that due to his deceased namesake, this was seen as triggering a second rejection. Take the most famous case study in the history of psychiatry, for instance, and you combine this family pathology with an extreme example of physical restraint I described earlier in triggering the withdrawal behaviour when under threat. You would find very few professionals who would now argue that the strange machines designed by the prominent German educationalist Maurice Schreber did not have a role to play in his son's famous delusions. Many of the phenomena in his son's writings seem to reference specific machines such as the chest compressor, and the son, Paul Daniel Schreber's complete fragmentation of identity would seem to originate in the domination experienced from an emotionally cold and manipulative father, mother and wife. Just as with the characters Carol Gilligan has indicated in fiction, these patients all internalise some sort of life lie and denial of their own agency. So at the midpoint of the shameful lie, which is the end of Unbearable, Lightness, we move towards a literal eclipse that mirrors the fantasy eclipse of the last chapter, a sun's eclipse. Here are all the ideas for the 16-chapter graphics of a similar theme. The plan is to have panels of flashback to the Part 2 time of the 1999 eclipse. In that period I had been caught up in the pre-millennial New Age frenzy and had developed the new, now understandable, protective and Yalmar-like delusion that I could save the world with a great philosophical work. So I posted the manuscript I'd been writing while at Lancaster University at the point of the solar eclipse of 1999. This event in the novel, therefore, becomes a midpoint mirror of the final chapter, a false success to mirror the final success of hopefully genuinely using knowledge on the human condition to exorcise a particular ghost involving a number of life lies. The protagonist, 2020, both literally conveying the wisdom of hindsight from the year 2020 and metaphorically representing 2020 vision, becomes an exorcist confronting the traumatic antagonist No-Face. The huge black body eclipsing the sun becomes one with the black ellipse of No-Face and the black ellipse of each musical note carried in the Swan song motif. Another communication of the visual black ellipse multi-level metaphor. Yet again I thought there was something I could do there with graphics that could not be easily done in prose. I was in fact less abstract than the way it might be done with audio in TV or film. It becomes clearer to the reader that the hollowed out ellipse of the antagonist No-Face is linked to redacted memory and unconscious editing within the process of the life lie. The edited memory of the Swan song finally moves from the abstract to the specific words of a medical professional in the final scenes, unifying this idea of looking and acting with his statement that the death might be due to a blow to the head. Is that the final fantasy eclipse? Signals are changed to the narrative. Multiple, in quotes, real timelines are witnessed as the realism of the central psychiatrist's scene fractures. 2020 will now clearly describe the buddy's concept of SEM as limited awareness, while via another timeline I listened to lectures documenting this limitation within psychology and neuroscience. The idea of the life lie and avoidance of reality is linked now to the Buddhist idea of the ordinary grasping mind, an island of ignorance within an island ad infinitum. The story strips away these limitations as the enlightened character 2020, prospectively me in 2020, opposes the chaotic ignorance of my character No-Face. 2020 explains that the Tibetan term Rikpa would be the knowing by seeing an object. Once the practitioner gets beyond Sem and Rikpa, there is supposed to be no division between the seeing and the seen object. By the end of the novel, No-Face would be a manifestation of Rikpa's opposite, Marikpa, the most fundamental of unknowing or ignorance. The ignorance of space is so extreme that we are said to lose all perspective outside of our own solipsistic black cloud of unknowing. We can supposedly get beyond this ignorance generated by the limited awareness of Sem. with the insight provided by Rigpa, the active seeing, but true enlightenment is a level beyond this. All this is narrated by 2020 to his previous selves and the reader. Along with this narrative, we have the science and the process of traumatic reaching or grasping, in which the body is restrained but the brain reaches out. This is if I think this ambition is working, otherwise we'll have to scrap some of the complex multiple timelines. Finally, we have the last twist of the novel, that the writing of the novel is part of a PhD project. Part of that project is an attempt to create a form of narrative exposure therapy. With the reader deciding if they think this has succeeded, Nophis literally comes through the demolished wall of the room after the eclipse. He begins to literally consume the multiple brain state selves, one self at a time, as they try to stop this antagonist from reaching what I call patient zero, the only self with no forehead tattoo. 2020 is therefore narrating the PhD research revelations on the human condition, exorcising them as No-Face continues to consume alternate selves. The psychiatrist comes to take on the appearance of various characters from my autobiographical experience, as we have intense dyadic truth-telling conversations, finally with patient 0 and 2020 facing each other. The intensity of 2020's narrations grows as No-Face runs out of selves to consume. With no selves left to defend the patient, No-Face moves towards 2020. 2020 rises from his seat and sacrifices himself while trying to avoid cheese. I will use his final lines to illustrate this idea of non-duality versus the toxic duality of narcissism. I'm working on the subtlety of the final line uttered by 2020, but it will be something like, there can be no duality, thereby indicating that this self-sacrifice was always necessary, and in fact the self must always be sacrificed for non-dualistic enlightenment. Having consumed 2020, No-Face moves to our patient, but No-Face is absorbed into the patient as the two merge, with No-Face now unable to sustain his darkness, while essentially containing the knowledge of 2020. The walls of the room collapse entirely, and this patient now rises from his seat and addresses an audience, like this one. He describes the problem of being split away from the present, highlighted by the come back to me bubble and my wife's observation that this dissociation was akin to me being pulled into a big black hole. I explain the shameful I thesis and the significance of dealing with the universal problem of metanoia, splitting the self in a form of regret, not content with the present. This ends with a single panel showing my wife's serious concern that was not, in fact, fully engaging with family life as a consequence. We then end with the last come back to me bubble. The final page is a family walk in the local countryside.